All right, I think we can begin now, and just anyone else can just roll in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event this evening. My name is Michael, and I'm the programming chair of the CIC Toronto branch. We're very excited to have you all join us for our event on the human dignity aspect of our foreign policy by Canadians study today. Before we begin, we'd just like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the CIC Toronto is seated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. This land acknowledgement takes on added implication, given the topic of today's conversation, as well as our recent headlines in Western Canada. So I imagine most of the people on this webinar are already members or involved with the CIC, but for those of you that are joining or haven't heard of the CIC before, just a few words. The Canadian International Council is one of Canada's premier forums for global affairs and operates a network of 18 branches from coast to coast. Foreshadowing the rise of civil society and new media, the founders believed that governments would increasingly come to rely on the support of their citizens in the conduct of global affairs. And consistent with this vision, the CIC's national branch network empowers citizens across the country to participate in discussions and debates on important foreign policy issues. Our Toronto branch has a diverse and enthusiastic group of members who share a strong interest in foreign affairs, international business and trade, as well as Canada's role in the global community. With that being said, we're very excited to share with you some of the results of our foreign policy by Canadians exercise. Before I do that, I'd like to introduce the speakers we have on for today. I'll begin with Maureen O'Neil, who will be hosting today's event. Maureen is a longstanding member of CIC's board of directors and was most recently appointed the chair of the CIC board of directors. And we extend our congratulations to Maureen. But apart from the CIC, Maureen was also heavily involved in international affairs, was named an Officer of the Order of Canada for Public Service in June 2011, recognizing her contributions to international development, gender equality, and human rights. She has led ministries and crown agencies in both the federal and provincial governments, think tank, and the healthcare improvement not-for-profit. And she is also a board member and the chair of international and national organizations, including Carleton University. So welcome, Maureen. Moving on to our panelists today, our expert panelists who have been involved in the process for a number of months now. We'll begin with Beth Roniak, who is the policy lead at the Equality Fund. Her work includes promoting more equitable futures through supporting women's organizations and movements. Beth also chairs the Women's Peace and Security Network Canada, which monitors commitments and actions by the Government of Canada on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Moving on, we have Lauren Dobson-Hughes, who's an expert on specializing in global health and gender equality. Her consulting firm has worked for organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank, and the World Health Organization, and Oxfam. And last but certainly not least, we have Nic Moyer, who's a leader in the Canadian development and humanitarian sector. He is currently the CEO of Cooperation Canada, an organization bringing together civil society organizations to push for a fairer, safer, and more sustainable world. We're very excited to have these panelists. Looking forward to the conversation that we'll have today. So just to give everyone an outline of the format we have planned, we'll begin with a panel discussion, and then we'll be followed by a Q&A period. So I'd encourage you to save up your questions until we get there, and we'll have more than enough time to answer all the questions you might have. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Maureen.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm delighted to be here talking about what is the biggest deliberative polling exercise that has been done in Canada. And deliberative polls are a very special thing. And I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about what a deliberative poll is and why this deliberative poll on foreign policy by Canadians is so important. What people were talking about as they discussed in 39 working groups, that is the sample of 444 Canadians, which is, it is possible to have a representative sample of the country that actually represents the country with 444 people. And we know this because there was a control group and we checked against that, or we didn't, but Stanford's Center for Deliberative Democracy, who was a key partner with us in this, did, and it turns out that we are pretty well A-OK on our sampling. We did this, the Canadian International Council did this together with CanWatch, the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, and with Global Canada. So 3 organizations joined together to do this, assisted by Stanford. And why Stanford? The Center for Deliberative Democracy at Stanford has pioneered the development of deliberative polls and has done 120 around the world in 30 countries. So what we wanted to look at, how Canada should engage in the world to advance the health of our citizens, to advance the security of our citizens, to advance prosperity, to advance the dignity of our citizens, and also to consider what our tools are for global engagement. And so how did we do that? Aside from selecting a sample of 444 Canadians who spent 8 to 12 hours in March and April discussing questions around each of those areas, they were provided with briefing materials, videos, opportunity to ask questions of experts. And as our 2 lead champions, we had a kind of background group of senior politicians and former senior public servants specialized in these areas that were providing support for this whole polling exercise. Our 2 champions, Lisa Wright and Anne McClellan, said this morning when we launched this, that it was the material that the citizens were provided with reminded them very much of what a minister would have as a briefing before they went to cabinet. So citizens were being treated like ministers in this. Citizens had the opportunity to be briefed on the substance of what they were going to be discussing, and then they had the opportunity to ask questions of experts. That is what sets a deliberative poll apart from a regular polling exercise. You know how it works with a regular poll. You're drying the dishes and Veronique's calls. They ask you for a few things. I studied sociology, so I always like to help the pollsters, but that's it. They can ask you questions. They ask me questions about things I hadn't thought about before I put down the dish towel. In deliberative polling, people are involved over a period of time, in this case, online, with a moderator, an AI moderator. So this was highly innovative. And they were involved online. They had the benefit of briefings. They had the opportunity to ask questions. And we had the opportunity to see how people's views changed from when they were polled first, before they had the opportunity to be briefed, and after the exercise, to see how people's views change. And this is why this is such an important exercise. Not only do people have a chance to engage with, discuss with, there are 39 groups, as I said, with other Canadians, and the other Canadians were a highly representative group. A little light on Indigenous. There was 3% of the sample was Indigenous, opposed to 4.1. Not quite as high a percentage of Francophones as we would have liked, 14%, when we really ought to, would have needed 23%, but very representative in terms of diversity. So they had the difference between the polling when you're doing the dishes and this is that we are able to see what people would think once they've had time to think about a question. Why does that matter for CIC? CIC is a citizen-led organization. We have 18 branches across the country. We are all people who are really interested in improving Canadian foreign policy. We had an opportunity to help shape the questions that went into this deliberative poll, and we will have oodles of programming that can come out of a review, a look at, a discussion in each of our branches of the approach that this sample of Canadians took in looking at how Canada should engage with the world. So today we're focusing on how to advance the dignity of our citizens. And I'm going to go first to, there were so many people who had played an important role in this, and the people who we have with us today were part of the expert panels available to ask questions, questions that were put to them by the citizens in this sample, in this deliberative poll. But I'm going to turn first to Lauren, who also wrote up that section of the deliberative poll.
Yeah, hi everyone. Maybe I could just talk a little bit about putting together that kind of ministerial briefing note to help guide people in their discussions so that they're having a fair and good evidenced base for their discussion, as well as allowing them to explore a full range of issues and not having it be shaped by my personal opinion or thoughts. And there was certainly a real capturing the key issues and the tensions. There's no point having a discussion over, do humans have rights? We're not putting that out to poll. That's not really a sort of within the Overton window of things we would think are relevant. But I also wasn't looking to set up false dichotomies like trade versus human rights, because that's sort of quite a trollish. You know, you're not going to have a nuanced, thoughtful conversation there if you're pitting people artificially into polarized positions from the get-go. And so really trying to find the issues of where there was an interesting tension that in a community of people we could have valid and different feelings and thoughts about. But again, without creating false dichotomies and pushing people into artificial polarized discussions. And it was actually quite challenging, and I think a good sort of exercise. I often say, like, if you can't communicate at a grade 9 level your idea, and it requires you a 36-page PhD thesis, you probably lost your way somewhere. And part of living in a democracy is that ordinary people should have the right to engage with and understand complex ideas in a way that isn't talking down to them or patronizing them because of a lack of knowledge or a lack of education. We are all educated in many different ways, but making the information accessible so that people could understand it and could have a thoughtful discussion. And it was really challenging, and I think a lesson for sometimes people who work in the community, that we can get too involved in ourselves and forget that there's an entire world of people out there who know nothing about what we do and should be able to understand it. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about then how watching the sessions of people engaging with the briefing note I wrote. We did some beta trial sessions as well, where we put the briefing note out to other CIC members actually who volunteered to road test it first. And I got to sit quietly on the other side of the screen and watch people dismantle it. And it was great. It was really helpful for CIC members to do that, because it showed me, like, oh, I didn't mean for you to interpret it in that way. Oh, I see what I've done there. Oh no, I need to completely reframe that. I've sent you down a rabbit hole. I'm sorry. And come back. Yeah, and then watching the focus groups themselves go through the material and think really thoughtfully and really carefully about it. I was honestly slightly renewed my faith in democracy to see people engaging so well and so thoughtfully, and then the ones who weren't, and you get trolls in any space, were just sidelined. It was great. Like, the hive mind really came through. So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on how and the lessons we learn, but perhaps I'll turn it over to Beth, who was also a co-panelist with me in those sessions.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks, Maureen, and thanks to CIC. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As was mentioned, this is a really important moment in our history and development as Canadians. And I think these it's important to take these land acknowledgements beyond the token and into the spirit of reconciliation. Just when I was looking over the findings, I was reminded of and if you'll indulge me, just a little quick story. And you have to know two things. One is that I'm originally from Saskatchewan, and my family are dyed-in-the-wool. They would vote reform if reform still existed. Pre-pandemic, I did travel a bit. I worked for international organizations, supporting their efforts to build programs that ensured women, girls, non-binary people benefited from the development work that they were doing. Anyway, one time I was out in Saskatoon, and my niece, who was about 10, said to me, "Auntie, are you a spy?" And I said, what do you mean, am I a spy? She said, "Well, Mommy and Daddy say that you're a spy." So I went to my sister and I said, "What do you mean? You're telling the kids that I'm a spy?" She said, "Well, we have no idea what you're doing, right? So we think the easiest way to explain it to everyone is just to say you're a spy." And for me, that was a really interesting insight into some of these issues of how we engage on foreign policy, that it was easier for my family to understand, to frame this in terms of intrigue and security rather than development, human rights, those kinds of issues. They totally gave up trying to understand the work from that perspective. And so I think some of these themes brought this back to me in terms of what came out of this exercise. So a couple of I have 4 points. I'm only going to go 2 of them because I think we could get into them in the discussion. One is for me, what are topics that we should be discussing in foreign policy? And I think that there's I know that for this exercise, we had to divide into different themes, but I think they naturally in the discussions, they overlapped, and perhaps going forward, we should encourage more of that overlapping. So for example, I think when you ask questions from a feminist perspective, issues on security come up as well as human dignity, and they're interlinked, that it's very hard to separate this. When we start asking what makes us secure as Canadians, people do gravitate away from purely military solutions to looking at health systems, to looking at human rights protections, to be secure, to be able to protest. They are looking at climate issues in terms of security as well. So I think we could explore some of those issues a little bit more. A second point in the findings that came through, or that came through really clearly, was the participants stressed that we had to be coherent between what we were saying globally and what we were doing at home. This is really interesting because when there were consultations, online discussions for Canada's feminist foreign policy late last year, this was also one of the points that people stressed. That in order to have a, whether you want to call it a moral ground to stand on, or to be a credible international actor, a global actor, we had to be consistent, that we couldn't say one thing internationally, talk about the importance of human rights, if we weren't respecting that at home. And I think that's a really constant and a really, really important element. And then we'll leave it there, but I think there's a lot of other issues to pull out from the findings and some other reflections as well.
Thanks, Beth. I love the idea of you as a spy, but when you think about it, how do people see foreign affairs? What is popularly written about? You know, there are spy books. It's exciting. They don't know how exciting working on international development is. Now let's go to Nic, who's been probably involved in too many negatively exciting experiences if he's been working on the humanitarian side. But Nic, over to you.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you to CIC for the invitation and for the great work that went into this exercise. Really a lot of depth of thinking and analysis, and you know, it's hard to actually pick the few things to talk about in this. And before I go any further, I will say I'm on the same territory as Beth, and so on the beautiful unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and you know, continue to learn every day about what reconciliation needs to mean for all of us. And actually, reconciliation is largely about dialogue and its acknowledgement of where things are at. And I think that this exercise tells us quite a bit about how we need to be better engaging with one another. You know, the foreign policy files have long been challenged by a difficulty of sort of connecting domestic political interests with complicated international files. You know, how does one choose to vote? You know, often not based on international concerns. And so there's been this challenge very much in sort of underpinning the kind of political support that there may be in our democratic systems for the decisions and investments that, you know, some may think need to happen on the international stage, certainly that I do, whether we're looking at security or diplomacy or international assistance or trade or immigration for that matter. And so I think that there was a really important element here of trying to ground thinking and analysis on foreign policy with what Canadians are thinking themselves. And a beautiful starting hypothesis that when given the information, they will make informed choices in ways that can be helpful to policymakers. And I hope that's an insight that we can build upon. I'll just start with some of the things that I took out of this exercise and then really look forward to where the conversation will take us. I think it's really quite revealing that this exercise, unrelated to necessarily foreign policy, it really showed that actually exercises such as these that force dialogue and the confrontation of different views really do reduce polarization, increase respect for one another. And I think we need to hang on to that because we're entering a phase of great polarization in public discourse. And I think that's an insight that actually transcends the foreign policy issue, but that should be retained and should tell us something about how we should structure conversations on complicated issues instead of speaking at each other to actually figure out ways of hearing from one another. I did really notice a few things in terms of the numbers. So I know that some listening to us, you can have access to the report. There's a lot in there. We won't go through it all. But I did find significant that overall, there was actually quite a bit of support for international engagements, principled stances right across the different categories. But it was notable how little many of these changed, or sometimes actually support may have decreased in some areas after significant deliberation as participants were realizing I need to pick one over another or deepening their analysis. But it's also notable to me that some of the largest increases in support actually happened when looking at elements under the dignity sort of heading. You know, I really was very glad to see the results coming out of the conversations around a feminist foreign policy, that Canadians would support this, but then also that after really examining it, that they would increase that support. And I could be wrong, but I think it might actually be the largest increase of any of the specific proposals that were put to participants. And really what it was saying was this was the idea of putting human dignity at the center of our Canadian foreign policy. And so that was very encouraging to me. But I will also say that it helped us also understand that these are complicated topics, that you do sometimes come up against preconceived notions. Feminism in the process was identified negatively by many participants early on, but then that changed, that shifted as the conversations took place. And I think tells us we can do better in how we engage, communicate with others. Probably the most salient thing for me, though, when it comes to the findings themselves, was consistently this connection between Canada and what we do internationally. Beth, you spoke of this avoiding the cognitive dissonance between positions or actions that we have at home and how we act internationally. And you see it in many of the findings, and really, really notable for me. And I think that the folks behind the Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise will need to take note, because it's basically 90% of participants, which is incredibly high, support the belief that we need to have the same standards for environmental or human rights actions in Canada as for overseas for Canadian companies. And so, for a long time, everyone would scratch their head, well, why wouldn't we, and obviously every Canadian, or almost, seems to believe the same. And so this connection between what we do at home and how we act at home and needing to represent that internationally certainly comes through for me in this. And finally, I will say, we might get to it later, so I keep adding a point, but I'll stop after this one. Just that I'm a little bit surprised. I'm not sure how to entirely process it yet, how little support was garnered for investment in the mechanics of diplomacy. That actually this wasn't an area, even after deliberation, in fact, the support decreased for investment in new, whether new embassies or the diplomatic corps. And, we know what kind of impact they can have, but maybe this speaks to this inability for us to really explain the impact or demonstrate that to Canadians. So a few thoughts from me, and I look forward to seeing where we go from here.
Thanks, Nic. Let's pick up a bit on the discussion around feminist foreign policy. As Nic said, this is an area where there really was a very interesting movement, and where there needed to be greater explanation about what the term actually meant and how people settled down once they'd had that discussion. Given how important it has been to this government to articulate that and to act on it, what do you think people at Global Affairs ought to take from this discussion?
I don't mind starting with this one. I think what I found really interesting from the discussions we had live with the participants and some of the reflections is that people first interpreted feminism to be quite narrow. They almost saw it as being separate from support for LGBTQ issues, as being separate from championing the rights and priorities of people with disabilities. And so once the conversation, as you were saying, Maureen, said, no, the kind of feminism that we're looking at and hoping to see reflected in Canada's foreign policy is much more inclusive, much more respectful of diversity, much more, to use even the word now we've heard the Prime Minister use, much more intersectional, then actually, rather than saying, oh, well, that's more complicated, people said, oh, that's simpler, and found it easier to get behind. So I think that's really important. And I think also for Global Affairs, I think they're going to be surprised at how widespread the support was in this process, because I think that there are significant portions in Global Affairs who are behind a feminist foreign policy. There's also a lot of traditional foreign policy practitioners who come from a background where this wasn't part of their education, it's not part of their formation, and they still actively question what a feminist analysis contributes to discussions of realpolitik. of security, of trade. Yes, it's we can talk about girls' education or maternal health, but when we get to really serious foreign policy issues, actually, feminist analysis doesn't really have anything to contribute. So I think this is a really interesting push from this process to say, actually, Canadians believe that these issues belong in foreign policy discussions, that the kinds of questions that feminists ask about power, about what makes us secure, about norms, about Canada's role in the world, about support for human rights, these are all really important foreign policy issues for Canadians, and should be part of how we're represented and how we move forward.
Thanks, Beth. Lauren, would you like to come in on this or expand it or perhaps pick up? In other words, do people have a point? In other words, if your concern is nuclear non-proliferation, do you have to kind of turn it around and ask all the questions about how do you add a feminist analysis to that? Or in fact, are there a wide range of issues on the human security front in keeping us safe that are amenable to this, but there are some others where that isn't the dominant issue?
So I think it was interesting for me in the sessions to listen to people's understandable misunderstandings about things. And it told me, at least, a lot about what people understand by the word feminist, which Beth got at. But even things like, at first it was like policy. What does a policy do? It's like a document that sits in a cupboard in Ottawa somewhere, right? But then when it was actually explained, like, no, it's so all of government is doing the same thing, and we're not doing one thing with the left hand and the right hand's undoing it. And it was explained in an accessible way. People were like, oh, okay, no, that makes sense. Yeah, we can't be doing this on this side and that on the other. And so even the language that we use and sort of assumption that a policy, people would understand why it's important for Canada to have a coherent, cross-government, multi-departmental, stakeholder-involved, evidence-based, informed, etc. policy. And that wasn't clear to people initially. And I think what was also missing was, in terms of what GAC would take from this, there is support among the public for the work they do that is untapped. What was missing, I felt, was an understanding of the how and the why. So people were aligned on the values and the interests they wanted Canada to espouse, and they didn't as much distinguish as I thought they would do between interests being mainly trade and economics and values being nice principles. They actually quite saw them as the same thing. It is in Canada's interest to espouse values. But they didn't, the how, and going back to that, what is diplomacy? There was still a lot of questions around value for money, as if diplomats are sort of swanning around in Cartier watches and drinking champagne, which I think if you spoke to diplomats now, they would find that quite hard to hear. But they didn't understand, and because we don't talk a lot about the art of diplomacy, what it means in a real way in, say, a multilateral institution or inside the UN or at the WTO, what do Canadian diplomats do in their job to advance? And so it felt very like, oh, I don't know, they just swan around being important and live off money. And the why does this matter as well, was not clear to people. And I think there's a real gap there for going beyond the usual suspects. And I include myself, in that, but talking to people inside the bubble circles about the work that we do, and then breaking down these artificial silos and divides that even sometimes we just subconsciously reflect, like Beth was talking about. that, you know, trade and economics is on the hard side, and girls' education and gender equality is the nice, fluffy, soft side that we leave to the women in the corner. There is still a little bit of that unconsciously reflected in the way we talk. And we have to internally challenge ourselves as a community and as, you know, Global Affairs Canada to not do that, because then it comes back out in how people understand the work we do. So I'll stop there. I have other thoughts, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Nic?
Well, both of those were great interventions. I mean, I'm not sure that I need to add a whole lot. The insights are all very sound, just in terms of identifying the real relevance of this, that when Canadians confronted with, grappled with the complexity of the issues, I think the feminist foreign policy concept is one that still has a distance to travel in terms of support, but has a really good base. And once we learn to figure out how to talk about it in ways that people understand, I think we'll see that support keep growing. But I think that it really also speaks to this question of policy coherence. And so you just see it keep coming through in all of the conversations, whether we can anchor it around the feminist foreign policy piece, but it's about centering, our principles and the values that we uphold as a country within our foreign policy instruments. But and I said this before, but this was to me a current, like right through a lot of the findings, because you see it on the company's sort of behavior questions, on issues around advocating for rights abroad. We need to be credible at home, and so that's really something that I guess has rested with me. I think I'll stop there so we can pass on to another topic. And
Lauren has said just a bit about how in the development of the briefing materials there was a real attempt to say some people think about this issue one way and other people think about it another way. So in a sense, like a good briefing note to a minister, that needs to be reflected so that the power of both sides on a question can be absorbed, debated, and then a position understood. How well do you think we were able to do that? It's very hard to do because often in Canada, a lot of foreign policy issues are not distinctly different between political parties. In fact, for decades, the kind of warm glow of Pearsonian diplomacy, Pearsonian foreign policy was absorbed and practiced by both political parties, depending on when you look. I mean, certainly the Conservatives under Mulroney took forward much further than previous governments had work on anti-apartheid in South Africa, including risking his relationship with Margaret Thatcher. So there has been quite consistent thinking, shared thinking about what Canada should do internationally. I think one of the areas, I'm supposed to be hosting, I'm not supposed to have a view, but of course I do. I think that one of the areas where there was a difference of opinion was around the utility of embassies and diplomats and the utility of foreign aid. Because I think we can see when the kind of precipitous drop in foreign aid began, which hasn't recovered, and also, in a sense, the denigrating of the importance of foreign policy practitioners. We didn't get into that level of detail with people, but I think that, frankly, if you look at the lack of understanding about what diplomats and, if we could say, practitioners of foreign policy actually do, I think 10 years of disparagement probably has an impact on people's ideas about this. So having said that, moving on from there, one of the areas, and Beth, you talked about the need for, well, both you and Lauren talked about the need for policy coherence. In one of the other areas that were under discussion by people participating and engaging in the deliberative poll was global health. And there, although the focus was on WHO, you could see WHO as the example of a multilateral organization. So people were discussing whether Canada should be financing it, etc. And then we come to another part of the polling where we talk about who should be supported. Should we be supporting other governments? Think about this in terms of foreign aid, or should and indeed in supporting women's equality questions, or should we be supporting communities? Did any of those responses surprise you?
I think, so for me, what I found interesting was around this idea of sovereignty and autonomy of other countries. And it was in the briefing note that sort of some people feel that Canada can't be advancing values on the world stage in other countries because it's interfering in other people's sovereignty. In other countries, you can't just go wandering into Angola and tell them they're doing it wrong. And I think like Beth in that session had a really great point around that's not how it works anymore. That's a very top-down, old school model of development that assumes, frankly, colonial structures, that we are better and we talk down. And really it should be much more of a partnership. But there was still, I think, in people's minds a very, and not in a blaming way, we live in a colonial country and the whole global north and south dichotomy is itself a colonial construct. So like, but people really seem to reflect that and then brought it back to that idea that if we're not walking the walk in Canada, we shouldn't be advancing elsewhere. But this idea of sovereignty and autonomy, and then people sort of, oh, if we can't do that, then what do we do? And it was like that they didn't have a toolbox. The toolbox of what they understood Canada could do to advance was quite limited. And again, around the role of diplomacy and not understanding really what foreign affairs is. But you sort of saw some, like, we could sanction. So sanctions came to mind because people have seen that in the news. Foreign aid was interesting because it almost forms a lightning rod, I find, for people's feelings about how we show up in the world. And I found there was there's sometimes quite a disconnect. I'll be honest, I found one of the sort of thematics, I think, of the discussions was, this is my British hat on, quite Canadian, that there was a real, we want to do good, we have strong values, we really support the values, we're very yes. And then when it came to, okay, but what do you want to do? There was a lot of, oh, we can't do that, we can't do that either, but we shouldn't spend any more money and we should take care of things at home. And I really noticed there was a lot of goodwill to doing things, but when it came to actually saying what we would do, there was actually a lot of, oh, but how's the money spent? And I think it's going to be wasted. And these people, and you can't go wandering in and you can't, and there was just a series of concerns that effectively made the delivery of the value that everybody had wanted to advance impossible. And I found that really curious and quite a Canadian thing, I'll be honest. I don't know if that I've just like thrown a giant landmine in there, but if other folks noticed that, I'd be curious. Beth or Nic?
I'm going to go to Beth now, and then I'm going to ask Michael to take us to the questions because I've seen a few popping across my screen. Beth?
Well, it's it's interesting because some of it would be interesting to talk to the people who listen to the transcripts of the discussion groups, because what we have are the sessions we participated in and the report. And one of the things that strikes me about the report that's really interesting, and the survey results, so you've got the pre and the post, and you do see, as Nic was saying, this slight erosion for some of these propositions. But if I look at it, what I see, I don't see people moving against, right? They're moving into the middle ground. And it's almost like, oh, there were these things that I hadn't really thought about before, and it's more complicated than what I had thought. And maybe that's, I think, one of the really interesting parts of the deliberative polling process. And then for me, then that raises the question of how do we then move people into constructive spaces so they don't get into this paralysis of what Lauren was mentioning. So is it that we need more interaction to explain actually how does Canada's international assistance work, that this is not Canadians going over and telling people how to fight malaria or build wells. That's not how our aid money is spent. Is it more awareness of, you know, when Canada goes in to negotiate a trade deal, we have to have really smart, informed, capable diplomats negotiating those trade deals, or we're going to be all kinds of bad things are going to happen, right? So I think that maybe there's a space in that growing awareness to take the discussion up a level and to bring some of these nuances in. It's not automatic and it's not easy, but we have to, I think, bring those spurts of insight to help people understand this increasingly complex global reality that we're living in, and how as Canada, and how we negotiate all those spaces so that they don't fall into this, oh well, we can't, you know, oh there's a problem with that. And how do we move forward in a constructive 21st century innovative way that learns from the insights, and that builds on bringing in these different diverse voices into the conversation. So we're not just using old foreign policy solutions to address today's global challenges.
Thanks, Beth. Michael, I think we have questions. At least I saw some going across my screen. Would you like to give people out there a voice for their questions?
Yes, absolutely. So we can begin our sort of just taking in some questions. Feel free to post your questions into the chat. I see we already have 5 questions pending, but also feel free to raise your hand. If I see you, I'll let you speak as well. But I think we'll begin with a question from Chris Kilford, just because we were just touching on this topic. And his question is that the data was clear that Canadians support human rights, but interestingly, the largest ranking movement either way was on the question of Canada should review our trade agreements with countries that violate human rights, which went from the 5th position of importance down to 15th after deliberations, which may imply that perhaps this issue is not important, but also maybe, Beth, as you just touched upon, maybe it's because we've come to the understanding that these issues are much more complex, and maybe this is the reason for why we've seen the decline. And maybe you have some additional thoughts on your reasons for that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I should point out that if people are really interested in particular aspects of this, many CIC members contributed to writing up the discussions that took place in the various working groups on different subjects. And you can certainly, I'm not sure, Michael, if those are posted yet, or if people, I know they exist, so certainly people can get at them. Yeah. Did anybody want to add to, because Chris's was really a comment, not necessarily a question. I'm sure Chris has got an answer to his own comment, but does anybody want to add to that? I think Beth saying that the complexity of these questions also cause people to, well, the opportunity to discuss a complex question, not surprisingly, leads to a change in what people's views are on that question. Does anybody, including Chris, want to add to that?
There, Chris, I'll let you say like, here you go.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you, Maureen. You can hear me, I hope.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, I picked it out because, you know, I spent a lot of time analyzing the results, and what struck me was this particular one because it had the largest movement from people being asked before and people being asked afterwards what they thought. And I remember being in some of the rooms and when China came up and we were trading with China and people said, you know, well, they've got human rights issues and perhaps we shouldn't be trading with them. And it really came back to, I made a note here, you know, we love those price rollbacks at Walmart. And people said, you know, look, what are we going to do? If we stop trading with them, we'll have to stop trading with that country and that country and that country. And so it was actually quite interesting to watch that discussion taking place and people's attitudes shifting a little bit on what is fundamentally a very important question. You know, who do you trade with? When they obviously have human rights issues, and we should be dealing with it and talking about it. So I just raise it because we've been focusing on a lot of the positive stuff that has come out, and this is a shift that is a little bit worrying. So it's worth discussing it. It's the same issue we found with the question on chemical weapons. Canada should be leading a discussion on chemical weapons. And it fell very significantly once people got into the room and started saying to themselves, you know, what can we really do as a country? And I think actually we can do an awful lot, but it was interesting to see that particular shift. So yeah, I just wanted to raise that. It's interesting and it deserves to be talked about along with the positive shifts that we've seen. But great work, everybody, terrific.
Thanks, Chris. Michael, do you want to move us on to another question?
Yes, sure. I see that Dennis has raised a question in the chat, but he's also got his hand raised. So Dennis, I'll give you the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I was a co-organizer of Foreign Policy by Canadians Human Security Conference with CIC Winnipeg back in November. And my question is twofold and addresses more lessons learned from this project and the research that was done. I looked at the numbers at the breakdown of individuals who participated in the discussions, these 444 people. I've noticed that Ontario and Quebec accounted for a total of 63% of participants. And these provinces have 55% of Canadian population. So these two provinces were already overrepresented. In the future, how will CIC, CanWatch, other organizations involved make sure that the process does not just privilege people into most populous provinces and in the metropolises in those provinces, because Francophones were also underrepresented. So I've attended a few discussions. Overwhelming majority of people there were from Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary. And individuals, for example, farmers, oil workers, and people from the north were seriously underrepresented, and I think it may have skewed the discussions in a certain way. And also my question here is, a lot of what I heard, I didn't just read the transcripts, I also was present for some of the discussions, was that individuals who participated spoke a lot of received wisdom, what they learned in schools, what they learned at universities, what they see in the media and on the internet. And what we have is a reflection of public opinion. How can we take this public opinion and then use our expertise, use the research that we have to influence it and to bring it in line with the contemporary conditions? My distinct impression was that the Canadians' idea of foreign policy is stuck somewhere in Chrétien era, and the world has since moved on.
First, I just want to make a point on how representative was the sample. It actually was pretty representative. And if you look at the, I think, I'm not sure that it's up there yet, but the control group sample to compare this to, it's actually very close. And there is an underrepresentation of Francophones. That means an underrepresentation of Francophones who participated, not who were selected. But on virtually everything else, and a slight underrepresentation of Indigenous people. But it's a pretty good, it was more than a pretty good sample of Canadians. So I don't think we have a problem there. On the issue, though, I want to ask our panelists on the issue of how do we do a better job, I think is what you're asking, of sharing modern contemporary research results around foreign policy questions with Canadians?
I think I have a couple of thoughts on that, Maureen. I think first off, representative sampling is important, and it's one methodology. I think it's also important to think about other ways of sampling. So, for example, when we were organizing the online consultations on Canada's feminist foreign policy late last year, we realized that we hadn't heard a lot from young women. We hadn't heard a lot from racialized women. So there was a specific group organized that was just young racialized women to talk about what they would like to see in feminist foreign policy. So that involved specific outreach, that involved setting up a space where they felt comfortable talking about those kinds of issues. And that yielded different insights, different voices, different perspectives to the discussions. And so I think maybe going forward, we need to think about different kinds of methodologies and different kinds of sampling to hear from voices that we haven't traditionally heard from, who haven't been part of foreign policy discussions, and who may feel a little bit shy or a little bit less open about talking about some of the issues that they would like to talk about because they're the only one who might have that perspective in the room, right? We're hearing this from Indigenous Canadians. We're hearing this from racialized people that, well, I mean, I'm the only one in the room, so I don't know if my issues are going to get any traction, so I'm not going to even raise them. So I think that might be an interesting way to go forward to talk about. I was on a conversation earlier this morning, and someone said, you know, who's not here? And who do we have to hear with to get a more complete vision of what it is that's at stake, what the priorities should be, and what some of the alternatives going forward. Doesn't it? I think you've raised a really good question too on the research results and sharing and how we communicate that. And I'll pass that one to the other panelists.
Well, maybe I'll jump in a little bit. I do think, you know, that good questions raised about participation, those are always good ones to raise. But sampling, as Beth has said, is one way of doing things, and polling is one way of doing things. I think this is a really great first step at trying to understand and get the pulse of how Canadians are thinking about complex foreign policy questions. I don't, however, think that it solves the problem of having an ongoing dialogue and creating political license for significant actions on the international stage by our Canadian government. And I think there's actually quite a bit of work and reflection that this can feed, but that is needed in terms of how we engage Canadians in the long run around this. And my sense, and I could be wrong, and this is just one opinion among many, is that foreign issues, will rarely be politically salient for Canadians. There are circumstances that could permit for that, but they are not very common. And so what I think is that if we could look at the lessons of this exercise to inform a process that provides political license and grounding for our foreign policy work in a way that actually allows some initiative taking, more so than is present today, sort of providing cover for the public service, cover for politicians to be able to point to a process that they know is legitimate, that is representative, I would be very encouraged by that, because I do feel that when we look at the sort of how our foreign policy implements, it does seem to happen behind closed doors, decisions that are questionable, often lacking political ambition. And a lot of this seems to stem from this disconnect between sort of these foreign policy issues and public opinion. So, I mean, I think that's what I would say, is that this is a great first step. These are good questions to be asking. And then what more can we do to build on the lessons of this process to feed future foreign policy conversations?
And I think, so Beth and Nic have addressed that kind of who was involved in this. I'd like to sort of learn those lessons and look to, as we further develop Canadian foreign policy, how does government, who largely is seen as the holder of Canadian foreign policy, engage wider, both in terms of public education, proactively building public support and understanding, but also like the framing comes down to who owns our foreign policy collectively. Is it GAC and government? And in some of the discussions, there was actually, from experts, there was actually this kind of, we need to depoliticize Canadian foreign policy. And it was quite a technocratic that, like, we need to take it out of the hands of politicians who make it inconsistent. And like, my gut reaction was like, that's not a democracy then. You can't have bureaucrats running foreign, it is inherently a political process and political. And if you don't like your politicians or don't think they're good at foreign policy, the answer is not to transfer your foreign policy to bureaucrats, it's to get better politicians who do it better. But really creating a plurality of who owns Canadian foreign policy. My sense of like engaging with GAC colleagues who are fantastic and skilled and wonderful is that there is still a barrier and a sort of veneer, a lack of trust about how do we consult? And it tends to be quite an arm's length managed process. And I would like to see a lot more fluidity and building of relationships between think tanks and academia and CSOs and grassroots women's organizations, because they can do things in the foreign policy space that government can't. And it's actually a value add to have the whole of Canada doing this work, as opposed to government owning it and consulting out where it wants to. And I think it's part of democratizing and building understanding. And like, for example, I think, is it Thomas Juneau or Justin Massey have a really great suggestion around academic secondments into GAC to bring fresh, different, new thinking from up-and-coming young academics studying foreign policy into GAC, which I thought was like such a great idea and a no-brainer to do a year secondment. And I would really like to see more of that to bring diversity of opinion and representation into who owns how Canada shows up in the world.
Just a small add-on to that. A number of years ago, the Women, Peace and Security Network organized a postcard campaign asking the then Minister of Foreign Affairs to take a more active stance on addressing conflict-related sexual violence. The strongest take-up of that postcard campaign was from women's shelters in Canada. And that was a surprise, but it shouldn't be a surprise, right? Like, who understands what violence is and the importance of dealing with it, but the people working on the front lines of addressing violence in Canada. And I think there's an important lesson in there of what Lauren was saying of and I talked to some of them, and they said we hadn't really thought about this as a global issue in terms of conflict before, but we see the links, right? So how do we get those voices into the discussion as well, and not just the people who studied international relations at university?
Very important point. And of course, Canada was actually very, very active after Kosovo, after the latest Balkan wars, multilaterally on exactly that issue, rape of women during the conflict. So, and the people who were very much engaged from Canada on that question were a combination of women who were working at the community level on these questions in Canada, and academics who were like Kathleen Mahoney, who had really followed this question. But it translated into what Canada was saying and doing within multilateral fora. So that's the other way. That's the other way that Canada actually has been very good over the years of bringing in NGO voices into multilateral positions. If we think about the various global conferences, whether on environment, whether on women, whether on human rights, it has been a habit of Canada to fund NGOs to be part of the Canadian delegation, and also to fund NGOs to be part of the NGO conferences associated with the formal multilateral conferences. And that has been a way, I mean, I think that's why we've now finally acceded to UNDRIP, the host of indigenous resolutions that were pulled together in UNDRIP. That's years of that kind of pressure. So that's another means by which other voices get moved in. But I think there's another issue, and that is at GAC, a lower level of people with specialization in foreign affairs actually being in the department. I think that's a problem, but that's a problem for another day. Michael, give us another question from out there among our colleagues who are participating in this.
Yes, of course. We have actually two questions from Daniel. The first one I'll just gloss over a little bit because I believe Lauren and Beth have touched on. Based on the loss of support for embassies, are there any paths forward that you would recommend for GAC? I believe Lauren and Beth touched on this, but Daniel also asked, would you recommend to shift to a digital approach? Not sure if anyone in the panel has any comments on this, but I'd also like to just share a quick plug that the CIC Toronto will be holding an event in the end of July, on July 28th, on the emerging field of cyber diplomacy as a sort of emerging means of diplomacy. So I'd invite you all, if you're interested, to keep an eye out on the CIC calendar for that. I think we'll move on to Daniel's second question though, which is that he says, I agree with Lauren's assessment of Canadian caution to taking strong, decisive actions. And do you think further deliberative democracy can play a role in taking these conversations to the next level, where instead of just reaching a consensus of opinions between the citizens, we may actually arrive at a citizen-led recommendation for concrete actions?
Very interesting question. Remember, in this deliberative poll, we weren't trying to get people in groups to come to a consensus and to make a recommendation to government. So what Daniel is suggesting is that you take it further steps, so that you basically say, okay, if you were sitting down with cabinet, what would you be recommending after all the discussion and all of what you've heard? You know, what would you agree to, and what would you be putting forward? Do our colleagues, Beth, Nic, Lauren, have thoughts about this?
Well, I mean, I think that this exercise tells us that it might be possible, but I would say that we would have to be careful not to get ahead of ourselves. I think that the way that decisions are presently made in these spaces are very far from this deliberative democracy exercise, which was done independent of government, which I think is really important to signal, that there have been historically foreign policy reviews, long-winded exercises by a public service that have not delivered the kind of changes that many would have hoped. And there are political leadership questions that are interwoven in here. Would governments be willing to give up the kind of strategic decision making that they can have in these spaces? It's hard for me to imagine that would be the case. But it does speak, the question actually speaks to this ongoing disconnect. And I do, between public opinion, where we prioritize things. Canadians will never prioritize foreign policy issues over their own security or their own, health systems or our economy. But where I think deliberative democracy could be interesting, or some version thereof, or some advocacy with government to do better at engaging Canadians in their foreign policy, is that if it could create the license to act in certain spaces, and it could help on the overall prioritization, where I think our government really does struggle at trying to be at every table and be all things to everyone, which is a bit of a Canadian thing, but we really struggle to make choices. And if we could actually structure input to global affairs that would help to make some of those decisions, that itself would be, I think, progress. But so some thoughts from me, and Beth and Lauren may differ.
Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting question, sort of where next with deliberative democracy. I think another element to maybe move forward in terms of breaking some of this paralysis that Lauren was talking about was to also bring in voices from outside of Canada. I learned an incredible amount talking to activists in other countries. I think for Canadians to hear some of the impact of what Canadian policy has on different communities could be really, really interesting. And I think that some of the issues then become much, much more real. So take, for example, the issue of LGBTQ rights in a number of African countries. A number of years ago, when there were very, very egregious human rights violations, there was a call to end aid to a particular country. This was, what's the first thing? We disapprove, so we're going to cut off aid. What we heard from activists in that country was, please, please tell your government not to end aid, because we will be stigmatized and punished even more internally if it gets out that food aid or other forms of aid that was coming in is now no longer coming into the country because of the government's stand on LGBTQ issues. So Canadians thought we had an easy solution to this, to take the moral high ground. But by listening to the activists, there were really clear signals, clear instructions of how the situation was more complicated, and here are some of the ways to deal with it. So maybe some of that, well, we don't want to intervene, we don't want to do this. We could enrich the discussion by talking to people who are working on parallel, similar issues in their own countries, and what kinds of policies, what kinds of intervention, what kinds of investments from Canada would be helpful to advance this shared agenda, a dignity agenda or human rights agenda or gender equality agenda or a feminist agenda. What would be helpful from their perspective?
And I think I have sort of three quick points around, sort of further engagement of sort of citizens into foreign policy. One is sort of a functional point around accountability and responsibility, that in a democracy, we need to be able to hold our government accountable for actions. And part of me does worry about laundering accountability. If responsibility lies with no one, who do you hold accountable? And the ability then of government, and I don't mean this particular one or any particular one, but to launder accountability without a good opposition to what they're doing. Good government requires good opposition. And when you co-opt all parties into a common position, you often lack an effective opposition to it. The second is that, you know, one of the things I saw in very small ways, but I often say that nobody cares so much about Indigenous access to clean drinking water as they do when you raise foreign aid. It is like the number one. Suddenly, so people who have never once in their life worried so much about Indigenous reconciliation, never mind clean drinking water, suddenly have a very strong opinion that that should come first. It is like a cliche to the point that you can predict it. And so we have to recognize that Canadians bring wonderful values and contributions and diversity of opinions, but they also reflect the prejudices that are inherent in us as people, as a community and society. And so how do you filter out as well for that? And there's a limit to people's capacity for what expertise they have. At a certain point, what do we do about Tigray? I don't know. And nor should Dave sitting in Tim Hortons or like Sheila in Timmins be asked to solve Tigray for us. There is a role for people who live in Tigray, who are Ethiopian. And it's often people tend to go, we should cut off aid. I literally saw that this morning. We should cut off aid to Ethiopia. Because it seems like a concrete, black, white, easy solution. And living in the gap of this is really hard and protracted. And you need people with lived experience who are from Ethiopia to be the ones who own their country's destiny. And it really isn't for me or anybody else here to say what should happen. So I think you're balancing a whole bunch of issues when you ask for greater involvement. It also needs to come with cautions and safeguards.
Thank you.
Maybe we could move
to another question, Michael?
Yeah, sure. So I noticed that, Nic, you just mentioned that, you know, sometimes Canadians have other things on their mind that's not foreign policy when it comes to like elections. And Beth, you just gave a great example of, you know, a seemingly good idea of a policy opening up a Pandora's box of unexpected consequences. And so the question that Chris raises is that perhaps it's handy for federal governments in some ways that during the campaign trail that foreign policy is often ignored. Do you think that there is some sort of maybe tacit appreciation in governments that they don't have to deal with these difficult foreign policy questions when it comes to, you know, elections?
Oh, so this is a suggestion that it is a kind of strategic avoidance.
What was it that Kim Campbell said that got her into all that hot water? Was that elections were not the time to have policy discussions, right? You know, it's a really good question, and I think one that this community constantly wrestles with, right? How do we bump up attention to foreign policy issues? How do we bump up attention to development assistance issues during elections? And maybe that's, you know, yes, that's the time when we're picking our government, but maybe that's not the election trail is not the best time to have these discussions on foreign policy, and we should be looking at ongoing, deepening, expanding the discussions in other moments. I mean, if someone were to phone and say, you know, what are your top 3 issues in this election? I sometimes struggle. Like, I guess I would say it, but then I'd have to give up one of the other ones that I think is really, really important to me too, for the future of our country. So I think it's an ongoing challenge.
Any other comments on elections and foreign policy discussion?
Well, I mean, I'd just say I think we have to be aware that foreign policy does not lend itself to short-term planning. And so we have an inherent built-in failure in our democratic system, in that we really struggle with the long term in our electoral cycles. Add to that it's basically all it's all downside potential. So think about Bev Oda's $16 glass of orange juice. You know, there is really something about, you know, you don't really gain votes by foreign policy, but you can lose them by losing a seat at the Security Council or looking ineffable on a global scene. And I think that, you know, it's a challenge for us to wrestle with. There's not a lot that I have by way of solutions. I think this has been an interesting exercise to help us start to think about what some of that could be. But I struggle with an issues-based world that we're entering, you know, and our politics they get turned, you know, on a dime to focus on one issue after another. And so the long-term thinking is problematic. I think there are reflections to be had about increasing the role of Parliament in foreign policy as opposed to a party in power. I think there could be, because there's great demonstration that there's tremendous alignment on the majority of sort of foreign policy issues. And if we actually could have some consistency through a foreign policy body, and other democracies have this, you know, this could actually be a way that we might be able to have longer term, more informed conversations and investments on our foreign policy. So I don't disagree with the statement that there are political games afoot and calculations that hold back sort of public policy conversation, certainly in elections, but even beyond. I'd just make a point to say that even though this government today made a lot of significant investments in the global COVID pandemic response, you can question whether they're high enough or not, but they actually buried those announcements while Canada was responding to the COVID crisis domestically, for fear that Canadians didn't want them to worry about international stuff. So announcements on Sunday nights, and, you know, and so what does that tell you about the political calculus at play? You know, and so these issues are beyond us, I think, today, but can we chip away at them? I certainly hope so.
Do you think, speaking of Parliament, do you think the Foreign Affairs Parliamentary Committee or the committees in Parliament that treat these different questions that are key in foreign policy should be setting up their own deliberative polling exercises with careful attention to both sides of the questions? Could that enhance the debate and discussion at a committee on foreign affairs?
I would like to see a lot more serious thought from members of Parliament around foreign policy issues. I mean, it's reflective of the way Canada treats its foreign policy in general, but like from the UK, where there are all-party parliamentary groups on Ethiopia, on Rohingya, and MPs take them seriously. They issue reports that are detailed. They care. They have emergency debates on it. All of the things that would tell you we are grown up and we are having a nuanced, thoughtful debate largely does not happen here because there isn't the incentive structure to reward it. MPs respond to internal party incentives and to voters, and neither incentivize spending your time and energy and precious members' office budgets on something like that. And I think it would be of great value. You can't ask one parliamentary committee to study the whole of foreign affairs for all of Canada, all issues. And so having groups of MPs who are able to delve deeply and thoughtfully, I think would be of immense value to the country.
Thank you. Michael, any other question? I see that we're coming to the end of our time.
Yeah, I see that we have about 3 minutes left in our allotted time, and we have a few questions left. But maybe I could just end on one that I thought was quite interesting, and this is coming from Scott. And I just wanted to, Laura, you earlier mentioned the importance of having lived experiences when we're conducting these policy decisions. And in this deliberative democracy, I think it's safe to assume that, you know, a majority of the participants may not have that deep sort of cultural understanding of these, you know, these topics that they've been asked to consider. And so Scott asked, how important is it to devote significant understanding and learning of the language and culture of particular countries or regions of concern? And how important is this advice when we consider our diplomacy vis-a-vis Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East? And maybe something I just want to add to that is that, do you think that maybe this lack of understanding, lack of complete understanding, affected the deliberation exercise?
In other words, insufficient knowledge about the cultures and languages of other countries have an influence on the way in which people think about foreign policy questions.
Well, I mean, if I may, I'll just say two things. One, of course, it's always important to understand another culture and to invest and time and effort in the relationships and the understanding and the depth, because it's only through respect that we can find common ground. And I think there is no such investment that is ever wasted. Ironically, I think Canada's just very well placed through its diaspora and global linkages to be very well informed about the rest of the world. With respect to the deliberative democracy exercise, I'll be very brief and just say, I think, although I wasn't part of the organizing groups behind this, but that it was really to get the pulse of Canadians around their priority issues. I think that if you were looking more closely at how to act, so the implementation of a priority or another, that's really where you would have to sort of ground test these and really factor in the participation and understanding of the views of the countries that would be implicated or the people that would be implicated. So, you know, interesting to see maybe how that could be layered on in a future exercise, but I don't think it necessarily undermined what this exercise was trying to do in terms of my read of it.
Thank you. And to say one last word in favor of embassies, I mean, one of the reasons why we want to have people stationed in other countries is because they are there within that culture. They are able to do the consultations with people who live there and bring that back to us when we can't do that directly. Michael, I think I probably should say just one last quick word before you say goodbye to everybody. And that is one of the most positive things in the deliberative poll was to note that the percentage of people who thought Canadian democracy was working rose from 70% to 80% at the end of their opportunity to discuss with other Canadians a range of really important topics. So I think that was a very optimistic finding from this deliberative exercise. Michael, over to you.
Yes, thanks. I think that's also certainly very encouraging news on the state of our democracy. I'd like to thank the panelists for joining our event and giving their wonderful expertise and insights on the results of our year-long exercise. Thank you, Maureen, for being such a great host and putting it all together. And lastly, thanks to all the attendees for joining our event. We hope to have a lot more CIC events focused on the Foreign Policy by Canadians event on all the different topics. So we really hope that you'll be able to join those and continue the discussion and to sort of just elaborate on what citizens can do in the foreign policy circle. Thanks, you all, for joining, and have a great evening.
Thank you.